All right, well, welcome again, everyone. My name is Soomin Han. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Climate Finance Policy Analyst at Climate Action Network Canada, and really incredibly honored to be joined by these fabulous panelists today and discuss the upcoming climate finance goal negotiations that'll be done in November in Baku. For those who are unfamiliar with Climate Action Network, we're also known as CAN-Rac, and a network of over 150 Canadian ENGOs from coast to coast to coast, and a part of the broader global network of CAN International. And at CAN-Rac, our goal is to really build consensus for the implementation of comprehensive climate change action plans by all levels of government, informed by communities, science, traditional knowledge of Indigenous rights holders, and our broad membership. CAN-Rac works in national and international policy domains and convenes the network to mobilize, share knowledge, and build power. And for those who've been joining us for the past couple of months, this is the third of a four-part webinar series on international climate finance in an effort to demystify and unpack the jargon and the complexities of climate finance in the lead up to November's COP29 that will be held in Baku, Azerbaijan. I'm currently calling in from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, colonially known as Ottawa, Canada. And really the context and the root of discussion today is due to the historic and ongoing colonialism and its harmful practices against the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, what we call North America, and across the world. And for those, again, who have been joining us for the webinar series, I mention every call that climate finance can be the means for reparations and advancing justice, and in our collective fight for climate justice as well. And the topic of the conversation today is the NCQG, the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. Give you a brief overview of what that is in 2009, countries decided that $100 billion USD per year from developed countries to developing countries would be provided by 2020. However, the 2020 timeline was missed, and while the OECD found that this goal had been met in 2022, Oxfam International found that the real value of financial support, specifically aimed at climate action, really only amounted to 21 to 24.5 billion. So what went wrong there, and what should be included in the new climate finance goal, and why is it important? Our panelists today will dive into this, and I'm so excited to introduce them. There were actually, unfortunately, some changes to the speakers list, and my apologies for that, and thank you for your flexibility, but I'm so excited to welcome these folks. First, we have Alejandra. Alejandra is a specialist in international policy and climate change with 20 years of professional experience, including international negotiations, international cooperation on climate change, and climate finance and urban mobility. And Alejandra is the head of climate diplomacy at Transforma. We also have Carola joining us. Carola is a Bolivian economist and climate justice activist, master in economics of development with 16 years of experience as advisor, consultant, and regional coordinator for public, private, and international cooperation institutions and networks, and holds lots of expertise and main experience in environmental projects, in climate finance, and sustainable development in Latin America. And she currently works as climate finance analyst for Latinidad. And lastly, but not least, we have Rebecca. Rebecca is CAN International's global lead on multilateral processes. Rebecca has a background in law and oriented her master's in international public law, focusing on international human rights law and migration, has worked with Amnesty International and Lawyers Without Borders before joining CNCD, which is a national umbrella organization engaging on various topics linked to international solidarity, where she was climate justice policy officer for more than 5 years. And she's been working intensively on issues such as climate finance, loss and damage, human rights integration into climate policy, and climate litigation. And she was also the policy coordinator of the Belgian Climate Coalition, the national network working to push forward climate ambition and just transition in Belgium. So as you can see from just the bios alone, I'm really excited to welcome these incredible folks with such brilliant insights and reflections to share. Again, unfortunately, Gaia and Mariana, who are set to be speakers, are unfortunately unable to join us today due to conflicting schedules, but really welcoming the panelists today. And if I see folks are introducing themselves in the chat, that is fabulous to see. Thanks again for sharing where you're joining from. If everyone could share which organization that you're representing, where you're calling in from, that'd be great as well. Okay, let's dive in. I briefly kind of set the context for what the NCQG is. And again, the NCQG is the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. It feels a bit like a mouthful, but I promise by the end of this webinar, you'll be very familiar with the acronym. Maybe Rebecca, I'd love to start with you. Curious if you could maybe share your thoughts on what are the lessons from the $100 billion USD goal, and what's really informing the NCQG conversation today, and if you could set the context, that'd be appreciated.
Yes, thanks, Soomin, and hi everyone. Good afternoon or almost evening from here, from Brussels. Thank you for the invitation. So just maybe to re-clarify, I'm not sure how much everyone is on the same page, so sorry if you're already finance expert, but so the 100 billion goal is actually the previous climate finance goal that was set up, agreed already in Copenhagen in 2009, and reiterated in the Paris Agreement. And the idea is for developed countries to provide 100 billion every year from 2020 until 2025. And this is the reason why, of course, we are now negotiating this new climate finance goal, assuming we're saying that the famous NCQG. So it's a very important question, actually, to ask ourselves, what are the lessons that we need to learn from that previous goal? And to be frank, those lessons are not so good. And so it's really important that we take into account what went wrong and try to modify and shape the new goal in a much better way. If I try to compartment the different key issues that we can observe from the 100 billion goal and the key lessons that we can learn, first, you can hear it, 100 billion is a way too low quantum. You may be following a bit of negotiation and the conversation, and you know that one of the big questions for the new goal is about how much, and we're going to delve into that. But the how much question about this 100 billion goal was answered with a way too low number. That was actually kind of a very last minute political decisions that's not based on the needs, that's not reflecting what is needed for adaptation, for loss and damage, and for mitigation. So that's the first thing that we need to assess. It's way too low and not needs nor science-based. And then when you look at the methodology of how this 100 billion goal is reported, how it is accounted, and Soomin, you were alluding to that, by OECD countries, you see all sort of methodology of double counting and manipulation that actually lead us to an overstatement of the numbers. And so you may have seen recently in the press, I think it was around May, that developed countries, so contributors countries, have claimed to have reached that 100 billion goal, finally, so to say, because they were very proud to say we finally met the goal. That was already actually 2 years too late. But also it depends on how you calculate what you contribute to. And because it's with their own methodology, of course, OECD countries have a very easy way to report what they do. But when you look at different calculation and different reporting methodologies, such as Oxfam's one, the numbers are way lower. So that's the first thing to know. And if you look at the methodology, you can first see a lack of clarity when it comes to additionality. You know that the Paris Agreement said that climate finance has to be additional, so coming on top of pre-existing international commitments, such as ODA, while we see that 92% of climate finance is actually coming from the same budget, so from cooperation or development aid budget. So it's not additional at all. And on top of that, loans that are very vast majority of climate finance, that's my second point, are often reported at their face value. And not with a grant equivalent methodology. So that's making the numbers look way bigger than they are, and we are already starting from a very low number. So that's one. Second, as I was saying, loans are accounting for the vast majority of climate finance, which is, of course, a very big issue when you think of the climate justice and equity perspective of the whole, climate finance conversation. So from the latest number we got from the OECD, around 70% of public climate finance was made of loans and often not at concessional rates. So that's, of course, a very, very big issue, exacerbating the debt crisis that we see happening in many countries in the global south, and linking, of course, to various consequences, the virtuous cycle between debt and resource extraction, leading to more fossil fuels, etc., etc. So this is a real big issue from a moral perspective, but also from a climate action perspective, of course. And linked to that loan problem, if I could call it like that, we see also an exponential role of MDBs, so multilateral development banks, who are often, of course, tending and leaning to that kind of instrument and sources. And they're taking more and more space into the climate finance conversation. And under the 100 billion goal only, they got an exponential increase of more than 200% actually between 2013 and 2022. So that's really something worrying, and is of course linked to the vast share of loans that we see delivered under climate finance. And lastly, maybe the last bucket of problems is linked to the lack of clarity on the thematic balance. You may know that the Paris Agreement is asking developed countries in the context of climate finance to provide finance balance between mitigation and adaptation. Nobody really defined what balance means, but one could understand that it has to be equitable, but actually adaptation has been neglected. Adaptation finance has been neglected all across the board when it comes to climate finance. However, developed countries have been, pledging and committing to double climate finance by 2025 compared to their 2019 levels in COP26. So there have been political commitments, but across the year, even though we hear often about that adaptation gap and the need to increase adaptation finance, adaptation has been widely neglected, and climate finance being mostly, I think, for three quarter going to mitigation projects. Of course, mitigation project needs finance as well, but adaptation is a critical and vital issue for developing countries. So not enough money, not adequate reporting, a lot of loans, and not a thematic balance, if I can summarize the different lessons from the 100 billion.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that comprehensive overview. I think that really just highlights, historic problems that have been just faced by many developing countries around the lack of financing and the types of the financing that is needed. And really, thank you for making that link of what that means and what we need in order for us to develop a better and more equitable new climate finance goal. And my apology, I see a note from Sophia asking for everyone to slow down. That's probably myself. But yeah, if folks could maybe take a moment to slow down just a little bit. And folks for joining us just now, we have live interpretation from English to French as well. That's available on the Zoom function at the bottom there. And if you could change it to French for that, then that's perfect. Okay, well, again, thanks, Rebecca, for that context. I'll pass it off to you, Carola. We heard about the lessons learned, and we're thinking about what we need to include in the NCQG with to really ensure that this new goal is developed from the lessons learned and best practices that we have gathered. Curious to hear from your perspective, why is this important for climate justice? What does climate finance mean in terms of the role it plays within climate justice?
Well, first, thank you so much, Soomin, for the invitation. Greetings from Bolivia to all the people that has joined this webinar. Well, climate justice is a key issue in this process of setting a new climate finance goal. Of course, as Rebecca was mentioning, when the first climate finance goal was set in 2009, it wasn't because global north countries or OECD countries were good guys. Was because they were recognizing they have a differentiated responsibility and a historical climate debt to the world that is disproportionately affecting our countries in the South and within our countries, the most vulnerable groups. So it is completely linked to climate justice. And that is why I want to mention two articles, and Rebecca was mentioning them, of the Paris Agreement. Article 2.2 is calling to respect this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And Article 9.1 called developed countries to provide these financial resources to developing countries to help them tackle the climate emergency. But unfortunately, as Rebecca was mentioning, this money, this goal has been unfulfilled for many years. 14 years have passed already, and we can clearly see no money coming. If most of this money is coming as loans, it is not accessible. The processes are not efficient, are not reaching the most vulnerable groups. So that is why it is so important to have a process to make all these mistakes right and respond to the needs, because when the $100 billion pledge was established in 2009, it was a random number. It didn't respond to any needs or estimations, and now we have estimations, and we know we need trillions instead of billions, for example. We know we know we need more money for adaptation, which is a priority in our countries in the South. We know that we need more efficient and fast and direct access windows for the groups that are in the front line of this climate emergency. So that is why it is very important. And I'm happy that this process of the NCQG has been open to observers, civil society, and other stakeholders, non-party stakeholders that are also proposing things, are raising their voices. And that is why we have a lot of expectations, and we hope this process of the NCQG could really result in the urgent provision of adequate, high quality, new and additional public grant-based climate finance based on the actual scale of the needs of the people of the South. And considering and acknowledging this enormous climate debt that global North countries owe to the world. And we have estimations that mention that they are responsible for 92% of the excess greenhouse gas emissions that are causing this crisis. And yeah, we don't really see political will to fulfill these commitments, to establish real solutions to tackle the climate emergency on time, and we are running out of time. And climate justice is about that. It's about responding in an urgent manner, especially to those that are not the ones that have caused the emergency, but that are the ones that are suffering from its impacts. And I'm talking from a country that is suffering right now from terrible forest fires, droughts, flooding at the beginning of this year. So it is something real. It is happening now, and we need immediate action. And this climate finance goal, we really hope it doesn't remains like a goal, but it's fulfilled. That is what we need. We need fulfillment of these commitments of these historical climate debtors.
Thanks so much, Carola, for your thoughtful answer there. And what I'm hearing really from you is, climate justice, and it's about addressing that climate debt and responding again in that urgent manner. Curious from your thoughts, just if you could mention briefly, what does this new goal, what would it represent in terms of global solidarity within the current global political context?
Well, we always say that climate finance is not about solidarity, but about responsibility, and about acknowledging that there's these differentiated responsibilities that need to be respected. And I think, and I'm always very frustrated when I hear global North countries and politicians saying in the negotiations that there is not enough public money to close this gap and to respond to the trillions that the world needs to tackle the climate emergency. But we can clearly see the public money going to the wars that right now are affecting and killing so many people in the world. So, and the public money is being used for fossil fuel subsidies. It's being used for extractive industries that are causing so many impacts, negative social and environmental impacts in our countries. So I would relate the process more to that kind of reflection, because it is about that. It's about rechanneling all that public money that is going to sectors that are harming people and the world to really tackle an emergency that is a global emergency, that is something that needs to be, needs real solutions now. And their money is there. We know, and we have a lot of estimations of how much of these trillions of dollars are going to the war. So it's about really putting the priorities and putting life at the center of the decisions, and political will, of course.
Thanks for that answer. Yeah, I think I'm reflecting lots on what you've shared there, and we've seen from a report by Oil Change International recently. It was a report called "We Can Pay for It" that shows, where's the global public finance going to, and how can we reallocate that to climate action. So I can link that in the chat later on. But if folks are really interested in knowing more about that, I'm happy to link that. And I'll pass it off to you, Alejandra. I'm curious. We're talking about, Carola mentioned, this is about responsibility, and this is about addressing that climate debt that the global north owes to the global south. Curious if you could share a little bit more about why is the NCQG needed now? Yes, we see the devastating impacts of climate crisis taking place all over the world. Why is this specifically needed now? And we also know that countries' NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, that is essentially countries' climate plans to mitigate, that's going to be due early next year. We also know that countries have developed their national adaptation plans, the NAPs as well. What does the NCQG mean for the timing of the NCQG, and how does it impact other climate plans that countries have put forward?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation, for being here. I very much agree with what Rebecca and Carola had just said. And I think that by hearing them, it is clear that it has been a long road from 2009 and the 100 billion goal agreement till now. But not much has happened, either on the delivery of climate finance and on the emissions reductions that are necessary to be in a trajectory of not surpassing a 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. And what you were saying, it's precisely what is calling for this NCQG now. We live in a moment of urgency of climate action. We have from now till 2030 to really change the trajectories of global emissions if we want to have a future that is kind of safe, because we already know it is not safe for us or for the future generations. But not only that, last year in Dubai at COP28, all the countries of the world agreed to a very historical decision. That's the global stocktake decision, where they decided that from now on, it is necessary to do a very specific sectoral transformations if we want to be in line with these trajectories. And these include transitioning away from fossil fuels, which basically means we cannot continue burning fossil fuels. We cannot do any new explorations. And we have to start closing down whatever we have already there. We need to triple renewable energy capacity all over the world, double energy efficiency, decarbonize the transportation sector, halt and revert deforestation. And we need to make the kind of infrastructure adjustments to all economic sectors in every country in the world, agriculture, water, health, education, in order for these sectors to adapt to the impacts of climate change that we are already feeling. And that costs money. So this historical decision that was taken in Dubai did not come with money. So this NCQG is fundamental to actually make all of these decisions and all of these transformations happen, to make them a reality. And most of these transformations have to happen from now till 2030 or till 2040. Like there's this assessment made by the International Energy Agency of how much would it cost just to make the transformations of the energy sector. And what they're saying is that for developing countries only, it will cost around 2.2 or 2.8 trillion dollars to facilitate this. That's just for the energy sector. When you take into account everything else, transport, health, agriculture, water, education, and the halting and reverting deforestation, which for many developing countries is the major source of emissions, then we are talking about a whole bunch of money that is like nothing compared to the 100 billion goal that we have now. So the NCQG has to be the enabler of these of the implementation of these decisions in the next 5 to 10 years, and of course in the future.
Thanks so much, Alejandra, for sharing that. And yeah, the ginormous number of 2.2 trillion minimum for just the energy sector alone in developing countries is really shows the scale of climate financing that is required and is needed, and the responsibility of global north countries that have caused the climate crisis in the first place to really pay up. I think all the panels have already shared about this concept of climate debt and what that means in its relationship to the NCQG that will be negotiated. So Rebecca, I'm wondering if we can maybe change this conversation into a conversation about the numbers, the big numbers that will be discussed at COP this year. What is the quantified need of climate financing? And if you could share a little bit more about the relationship of the NCQG and the climate debt that we've been talking about.
Sure, thanks for the question. Maybe two small disclaimer before answering your question. I want people to be cautious about those big numbers and those conversations around the big numbers, because that's gonna be the debate probably in COP. Can you hear me all right? My video is a bit blurry. Yeah, okay. So, I mean, numbers are really important and they are key, but I want also people to remember that without quality, so without being clear about what kind of finance we are talking about and what kind of sources of finance we are talking about, numbers don't mean anything. So of course, the 100 billion is ridiculous compared to the needs, and we need to talk about trillions now. So I will answer your question. But I do think it's really important that not looking at the numbers only and really be paying attention to the details of those numbers. And you will see, if you look at the media, if you look at political intervention, people are only talking about those big numbers as if it was the only part of the debate. But it's really important to remember that it's much more than that. And without quality, as I was saying, numbers are meaningless. And the second thing is, I think we have to focus on the NCQG to make it the most qualitative and most ambitious possible. But there are many things that needs to happen outside of the new UNFCCC doors as well, where we are talking about trillions and trillions of investments going in the wrong direction, where we are talking about a global architecture that's not fit for purpose and actually causing a lot of issue linked to the climate crisis. So of course we need to have a quantum that's fit for purpose in the context of COP29, but it's important also to resituate that conversation in a wider context, because the NCQG alone would never be sufficient to answer developing countries' needs. So it's important also to focus on what's happening outside of those doors. But that's a side conversation, of course. Now, answering your question. So I think it's really good that we mentioned this climate debt first, because we've been thinking, at CSO, how to talk about that quantum and, come in that conversation about big numbers. And the first thing we agree is as constituencies and to kind of bring a common message and a common campaign around this big finance here was to recognize this climate debt and to quantify it. So of course it's impossible to be precise, because many of the aspects of that debt are just uncalculable. But if you look at historical legacies and carbon budget appropriation, etc., we could estimate that 5 trillions are owned by the global north to the global south every year in the context of this historical climate debt. And this debt has to be paid, of course, by public money. We're not talking here about private investments and other actors coming in. It's a historical climate debt coming from developed countries' government. So that's the context and what we call the moral framing of the discussion around the NCQG. Now, looking at the specific negotiation, of course, that's also linked to the structure of the goal. At CAN, we've been doing some exercise and needs-based literature assessment, and we really focus on what we call the public provision core. So you can also look at the wider mobilization core, that's also including private finance. But our goal here and in our recommendation and in our submission was to ensure that the public provision core that will be delivered and committed by developed countries' governments or from public money sources is at least a minimum floor of 1 trillion. And when I'm talking about this public provision core, it's of course grants. We're not talking here about loans, but we'll come back to transparency and how to report that. But so looking at the very specific angle of this public provision core and trying to answer the needs based on adaptation, on loss and damage, on mitigation, it would be a very minimum floor of 1 trillion in grants. And that has, of course, to acknowledge that needs-based assessment are underestimation. So we will need to encompass in the decision a ratchet mechanism to ensure that we can revise this goal and making match the evolving needs of developing countries. And we know that when we are talking about the goal covering mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, which is not the given so far, if you're following the negotiation, you can see that many developed countries are rejecting the fact to include loss and damage in the new goal, but that's not even including just transition needs, which are going to be enormous as well. So of course, that's why I'm really emphasizing the fact that the 1 trillion is a minimum bar, but it's a kind of a way to look at the conversation within the public provision core and of course the grants. We are not talking about loans here. We learned from the 100 billion, when we are not clear about the role of loans, they just become the vast majority of climate finance. So that's a very important nuance here. And just maybe to finish my answer, so I was talking about those sub-goals. So really about looking at the specific structure of the goal. It's important to have specific public provision targets for each of those. Otherwise, if you remember what I was saying before, when we look at the lessons of the 100 billion, nobody will interpret balance the same way, and money will again go a vast majority probably for mitigation, while again adaptation and loss and damage are a critical component of climate action as well. So it's important to be specific and intentional on how much money should go for each of those targets, ensuring a balance is of course also reporting and accountability for each of those pillars.
Thanks so much for that, Rebecca. And thank you also for bringing up the conversation about sub-goals as well. I think that's one of the great divides of, the Global North stance and positions and the Global South's positions. Global North is very hesitant and shutting down any conversations around including loss and damage as a part of the sub-goal conversation. Whereas we know from conversations that have been going on for decades at this point, that loss and damage is a critical part of the climate financing conversation and something that is absolutely needed if we're talking about climate finance from the role of the responsibilities that these global North countries owe. And Alejandra, I'm curious if you can maybe share a little bit more about the quality of the conversation. I know Rebecca had already mentioned this provision must be from government and not loans, and how it needs to be grants and grants equivalent terms, and the really dangers that providing climate financing through loans causes for developing countries. If you could share a little bit more about why is it important that the quality of the quantum is clarified, and what are the specific aspects of that you're looking for within the new NCQG?
Yes, thank you. I think that both Rebecca and Carola have already mentioned several things of the quality of the goal and of climate finance. I would start by saying quality is also quantity. So the amount of the quantum in the end will matter, because maybe you have a really beautiful decision that is talking about the quality of the goal and it's 110 billion, and that won't do. So we need a goal that it's at a scale that's really much larger than what we have now, and definitely a goal that addresses the needs of developing countries, and that is basically that's aligned with 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectories. So that's one, and that's part of the quality of the goal. Then definitely the addressing the debt issue. So Rebecca was mentioning several of these numbers already. I want to remind us of two things in particular. Climate finance, basically, what it's doing now is putting developing countries in a false dilemma of whether I get debt to do climate action or to invest in development, in eradication of poverty, in anything, in infrastructure. Why is it that climate finance is provided in loans? And not only that, it isn't that these loans have really high concessional terms that are easy to pay, that have long maturity rates or interest rates that are very, very low. No, these are market rate debt. So for mitigation, 90% of mitigation loans are market rate debt. What is the international collaboration component behind that? And adaptation loans, 60% of them are market rate debt. So really, truly addressing the debt issue around climate finance, it's one of the quality parts of the NCQG that is most important at this time, and like righting the wrong, as Carola was saying. So that's one thing. The second thing is that not everything goes to mitigation, but that's also financing for adaptation and loss and damage, as Rebecca already said it. Third, access. And I have a really big concern on this. Like, getting to the point to access financing from any multilateral climate fund, like the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the GEF, or any other, takes a PhD to really just understand the process and get to the point of getting the money. It's really complicated. I worked several years in international cooperation in the Mexican government, and it was like so complicated, and each donor, like each counterpart, was so different that it takes years just to get from the planning process until you get the disbursement of funds. It's ridiculous, like the amount of time that it takes to get the money itself, access the money itself, is really, really hard. So there's a lot to be done in terms of improvement, harmonization, and actually, and one additional thing in terms of access is reaching the communities and the stakeholders that are doing climate action. Because there's a problem at the national level in developing countries, but there's also a really huge additional problem when we talk about local communities, rural communities, indigenous people, or women that are being directly affected by climate change, who have no idea of how to deal with this. And there's a lot of intermediaries that are coming into this, that are gaining 20, 30% of the amount of funding that could actually be used to do something on the ground. So third, access. And the fourth one, and I think it's also very important, I do agree with what Rebecca was saying about grants and not focusing on loans only for the NCQG. But the kind of transformations that we need to do need private investments. Like, I don't think we will get to 1.5 degrees Celsius without private investments. And the mobilization of these private investments has stayed only in the global north. So it's the US, Canada, Europe, China at most. Like, just moving the money around to invest in renewable energy and electric vehicles. This is not flowing to developing countries. And what we need to do, like in the next decades, needs really huge investments, real investments in developing countries also happening. And at the moment, I don't see anything that is meant to change this trend. So I think that's the fourth issue that I will signal as the quality of the NCQG.
Thank you so much, Alejandra, for sharing that. Yeah, and thank you really for naming that access piece. I think that's a conversation that is often left out. Yes, we agree, we absolutely need to do everything to land an ambitious NCQG, but what happens in terms of actually getting that money to the people on the ground is something that I think is left out of many conversations. So thank you for naming that. Carola, I think we've already heard, various pitfalls that we could potentially fall into when we're talking about negotiating the NCQG. But what are some risks related to the process of setting a new climate finance goal, and what are things that we should keep an eye out for?
Yes, thank you, Soomin. Of course, there are a lot of opportunities that could result from this process, but there are a lot of risks as well. And that's what I have been perceiving in these negotiations of the new climate finance goal. For example, global north countries are trying to dilute their historical responsibility, and they're using this process to include new contributors to have a broader contributor space, and they're using this excuse about the quantum. If you want like an ambitious quantum, we need more stakeholders involved in contributing. We need the private sector, we need the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, philanthropy, and they are trying to, and they are proposing this like onion structure to set goals like for everybody, not only for public mobilization, but also private, private sector, MDBs. And well, they are trying to do that, and that is a way to dilute their historical responsibility. And the other way to dilute this historical responsibility is that they are trying to align this new climate finance goal to Article 2.1c. And that is for me very clear, because I mentioned Article 2.2, that is the principle of combat differentiated responsibilities, that should be in the heart of climate finance. And I talk about Article 9, which is how developed countries, historical climate debtors, are called to provide this financial support to developing countries, acknowledging this differentiated responsibility. But what does Article 2.1c says? It says that all the financial flows should be aligned to a low carbon and resilient path of development, which is completely important and good. But when you include that article in the context of the NCQG and this negotiation of a new climate finance goal, then it will make a lot of sense to account all the flows, north-north, north-south, south-south, and that is why it is like breaking this logic of climate debtors provide to the developing countries. So it is a kind of confusing, because of course Article 2.1c is important and we need to do the efforts to accomplish that, but that's part of a different negotiation and different process. If you include it in the NCQG, it could result in this kind of dilution of historical responsibilities. And the name itself, I don't know if you have think about this, but new collective quantified goal lead us to this kind of I don't know, intention of trying to change the things and the logic behind this initial climate finance goal, which has been set in 2009, as we mentioned, the 100 billion pledge from developed countries to developing countries. Why are we discussing different things? There isn't a clear intention of global north countries to dilute their historical responsibility, and that is something that we need to be aware of. And of course, we need to try. We are trying to keep the conversation from the global south, from the CSO perspective, trying to respect the initial logic of climate finance as it was conceived, the initial climate finance goal. And I think that is. Those are some risks. And another thing I noticed within all this process, we are so close to COP29, and developed countries have avoided to discuss about the quantum. We only heard proposals from the global south, from civil society. but not from global north. So that is something risky as well. What is it going to result? Are we really going to have a result in COP29? Or this delay in negotiating the quantum is going to have us lead us to a failed result? So I don't know, those are the risks for me that I would like to share with you.
Thank you so much, Carola, and thank you for bringing in the 2.1C conversation as well. And yeah, it definitely does feel like one of the tactics that global north countries are using to try to, again, delay those conversations and to try to detract from the immediate needs of developing countries and really talking about the core at the heart of what this new climate finance goal should be. So thanks for naming that. I know we've heard a little bit already around the qualitative elements. Yes, the quality of the financing is important and the quantum is important. I think there are other aspects of the NCQG that should not be forgotten within this conversation. And Alejandra, I'm wondering if you can bring in some thoughts around what are the critical qualitative elements that must be included in the NCQG to ensure that it is rooted in equity and justice.
Yes, maybe drawing from what Carola just said now in terms of the attempt to dilute responsibilities from developed countries. So this attempt has two sides of the coin. So one is very clearly, let's get other countries and stakeholders to be part of the contributor base. And the other part of the coin, or the other side of the coin, is let's reduce the list of recipients. Developing countries did not cause the climate crisis. All developing countries should be eligible to receive climate finance through the NCQG. I think that one of the things that it's clear to me is that developed countries are trying to solve their economic competitiveness with China through the NCQG. And really trying very, very hard to get China to be a contributor. And the only way they are seeing that they can do this is through this discussion of the contributor base and getting it to be named as a developed country. And because it is almost impossible through the NCQG to do this, then they have like these negotiation strategies of broadening the contributor base or reducing the recipient space. And because they are not succeeding, then the kind of things that they are saying are in risking equity and justice in the goal is saying, well, we will just provide financing to LDCs and SIDS, to least developed countries and small island development states. So I'm speaking now for Latin American countries. With the exception of the Caribbean, which of course are islands, no Latin American country is a SID or an LDC. And Latin American countries are all developing countries. They are all vulnerable to climate change. They have all felt lots of impacts of climate change and losses and damage, economic and non-economic, in the last years. And not only that, they are championing climate ambition. Many of them have some of the most ambitious climate commitments or NDCs in the developing world. And this attempt by developed countries is risking the possibility of a complete region of the developing world being neglected from being a recipient of climate finance. So I think it is important. Latin American countries and all developing countries understand that LDCs and SIDS are the most vulnerable, and of course require some sort of prioritization in terms of climate finance. But that doesn't mean that other developing countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, or in Latin America are not eligible to climate finance. So that's one issue that I think it is very important to bear in mind, because it is easy to try to feel for LDCs and seeds and say, yeah, of course, they should be receiving climate finance. But that's basically leaving others behind in this process. And the second part, I think, that has to do also with equity and justice is addressing the disenablers of climate action head on. And so it's that and levels of concessionality, and we have talked about it a lot, but there's also high transaction costs of climate finance as it is now. And the use of different instruments, financial instruments, including instruments that are underused, like guarantees. So, I mean, I'm not a specialist on financial instruments as such, but I think it is easy to see that there are many other avenues that are not just loans. Thing with loans is that loans are a really good business for developed countries because they get repayments that are used for different reasons instead of being reinvested in climate action in developing countries. But there are other things that can be done in relation to how it is actually addressing these inequalities in the process of the NCQG.
I know you mentioned this conversation already. We'll park that for a moment. We'll return to that conversation. But because you've spoken quite a bit already about international financial architecture and debt justice, Carola, I know you've been working quite a bit around the relationship of debt and climate, and curious if you could share a little bit more about, the qualitative pieces that should be included in the NCQG, if you could talk a little bit about the work you've been doing around debt justice as well.
Yes, thank you. We already mentioned many things, and of course, one of those things is that climate finance should not be adding to this debt burden. Climate finance should be grant-based and not loans. That is a big and a very strong demand from the Global South, and a good opportunity for this new collective quantified goal process to have an improvement on that. But there are also different elements that we also need to acknowledge. For example, after the pandemic, inequality has increased a lot in our countries, but also as a result of these multiple crises, external debt has increased a lot in our countries, especially in developing countries, especially in Global South countries. There are around 60 countries that are highly indebted, and most of these countries are all also highly vulnerable to climate change. So they don't have enough fiscal resources to invest in climate action themselves. Climate finance is adding to this debt burden, as Alejandra and Rebecca were mentioning before. Latin America, 81% of the climate finance we receive in Latin America are loans. And these loans, and there are studies that have demonstrated this, as Alejandra was mentioning, are not concessional loans. Most of them have market rates, and the higher the climate vulnerability of the country, the higher the borrowing cost, which is completely unfair. And there are studies that are showing this, and it's completely unfair. And the higher your debt, the higher the debt of a country, less public resources are there to invest in the fulfillment of the country national determined contributions, the just energy transition we all demand, and something else adding to this debt burden is the loss and damage. Right now, we don't have like a loss and damage fund operative. We are not receiving grant resources to respond to all the losses we already have, and how our governments are and the people that is being affected by the climate emergency is responding is through debt, because to recover after these extreme climate events or these impacts of the climate emergency, these losses and damages are being translated to debt. And so that is why some people is not longer calling it loss and damage, but debt and damage, because the countries are really, and that is something that we have seen very clearly in the Pakistan case a few years ago, after the floatings and everything. What they have received was international support through loans, and now their debt is huge. And we have recently published 5 documents in Amazon countries explaining this vicious circle within debt, climate crisis, and extractivism, because that is the other element in our countries. Our countries are highly dependent on the export of raw materials, fossil fuels, mining, and now agribusiness is part of this extractivist logic. And of course, if our countries highly indebted, which, for example, is the case of my country, Bolivia, highly indebted, what the government is doing is promoting more extractive activities in places which are super important to tackle the climate emergency, like the Amazon. They are giving permission for fossil fuel extraction, production, mining. Like mining is leading to a terrible problem. Agribusiness and the forest fires we are living now is part of that extractivist system that allows burning to expand the territory for agribusiness, and it's completely a vicious circle. And we have demonstrated this in different 5 cases. Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia were cases where the external debt was very high. In the case of Suriname, which is a very different case, Suriname that didn't have like such an important extractivist system, and Suriname is one of the few countries that have more forest and absorbs more carbon dioxide, CO2 than the amount that it emits. It is still like a very important natural reserve, but due to this high indebtedness that they have renegotiated their debt with some Eurobond holders, and now they are forced to extract and to extract fossil fuels from their territory and to pay a royalty, an annual royalty, to these people that has but restructured their debt. So they are using this logic and colonial international financial system and debt as a new colonial way to really conditionate countries. And of course, the climate emergency is adding to this debt burden, as I mentioned, through the loss and damage, through climate finance. So it's completely unfair. It's completely unfair, and it's something that needs to be changed. And that is why we are demanding different solutions. For example, debt cancellation, debt relief for countries that are highly indebted, but that they are also highly vulnerable to climate change, will make a lot of sense. Right now, we hear debt for climate and nature swaps to be highly promoted, but they have a very, very small potential to solve both of the crises, the debt crisis and the climate crisis. And they entail a lot of problems that we have been analyzing in the case of Galapagos, for example. And they are not based in principles that need and should be established. So they are not the big solution. They are not the silver bullet that we need. And and we need another of other different things related to debt as well. I can mention very, very fast some of them. For example, moratorium and debt restructuring for countries that are affected by adverse climate-related events, and immediate access to non-debt generating resources to cover these loss and damages. Can you believe that under this new loss and damage fund, loans are also considered as a mechanism? It's completely unfair. It is super, super unfair, and something that we need to address in this process of the NCQG.
Thank you for sharing that, Carola. I think when you said debt and damage instead of loss and damage, that really stuck out. And I think you really highlighted the importance of ensuring that climate finance doesn't perpetuate and contribute to further chronic indebtedness that many countries face. So thank you for naming that. Rebecca, in the earlier parts of this call, this session today, you spoke about, how we track matters and transparency matters as well, and that contributes to the bigger conversation around the quantum as well. So I'm curious if you could share a little bit about different transparency mechanisms within the NCQG that are being discussed, and why is transparency really important for accountability and responsibility?
Thanks. Yeah, because as stupid as it sounds, there is actually no clear definition of what climate finance is. So I guess the first thing to do when it comes to transparency is to really clarify and make clear what climate finance is, but also what climate finance is not. Because it's actually one of the core reason why those lessons that we were mentioning earlier about the 100 billion and why we are in this situation now is because everybody can report and account things as climate finance because it's not clear. Of course, I think if you look again to the climate justice equity perspective of things, you would clearly know that it's not adequate to report hotels or fossil fuels project as climate finance. But yet here we are because of the OECD methodology side, but also because there is no common agreed definition across parties. There are many things that are reported as climate finance that shouldn't really be. So I think, a first avenue for the NCQG and for the negotiation is to set a clear process to agree on the definition, because sadly, again, as stupid as it sounds, I don't think we have the landing zone ready to agree in Baku on a definition. There is a parallel process within the Standing Committee on Finance that has been trying to, land on a common definition, but it hasn't been done yet. So we really need to speed things up and clarify when that would be done, because again, otherwise it's really hard to be transparent and also to be accountable for the climate finance provided. But also I think, and that's maybe something where there is a bit more openness, is to work on an exclusion list. So as I was saying, clarify what climate finance is, but also what it is not. And so excluding loans at market rate, for example, excluding fossil fuel finance, for example, carbon markets. There could be some things, I think, that parties could agree across the board. When we were in the technical negotiation, in Baku earlier, I think it was this month. I'm lost in time, but I think, no, in September, well, last month, yeah. We had some interesting conversation about that, and maybe because, the definition has been already kind of stuck in some corner of the negotiation, it's more complicated. Well, the exclusion list, again, as it should be there since a while, but again, it seems maybe something that could reach more agreement, and the ministerial today that was mentioned by different parties from developed and developing countries. So maybe something to watch there. It won't be a silver bullet, of course, but at least if we could exclude some of those, absurd component of climate finance as it was in the 100 billion goal, I think that could be at least a little step forward. And the other important thing is to use, of course, the enhanced transparency framework, so-called the ETF, to ensure that the tracking of climate finance is adequate, regular, transparent, and also that we could then include a category specifically for loss and damage finance. If we go along the reasoning that loss and damage finance has to be part of the new goal, of course, we need also to be able to report it and to track how much finance is going to it, because as Carola was saying, it's a critical emergency, and we know that the loss and damage fund currently is accepting loans, but is also only funded by, I think, 100 of millions. So we know that billions are far from being enough, but here we are talking about millions only from the latest pledges we had in Dubai. So there is also an emergency to allow tracking and reporting for loss and damage as well, because it's a matter of accountability and responsibility. And if we don't get transparency right, it would be really hard to rebuild trust around that new goal. So it's really a key component of the conversation as well.
Thank you, Rebecca, and appreciate you calling in that lack of solid and agreed definition of climate finance. That was one of the first things that we had talked about in the beginning of this webinar series, and I think people were baffled that no universally agreed definition exists. So hopefully we'll see some progress on that this year. And now moving on to the contributor-based discussion that I promise we'll return to. I know this is no conversation to rush. We are kind of on the 20 minutes left of the conversation, I want to ensure that we have some opportunity for folks to ask their questions as well. But Rebecca, if you could maybe quickly run us through the various proposals that are, being made to influence the contributor-based discussion. We've seen, I think, 2 submissions around what that could look like, which new countries would be added onto the existing list if we can name them, and what does this again mean for the broader conversation around the NCQG and how it relates to the Global North's responsibility to pay the climate debt to the Global South.
Thanks, Soomin. I'll try, but that's a hard exercise you're giving me. But so maybe just to give a bit of a context, I guess you've been talking about this, but just to resituate the conversation. As Carola said earlier, so the contributor-based conversation is happening in the context of negotiation where developed countries haven't been giving anything around, those key political conversation. Nothing on the quantum, and they are asking, this contributor base to be the other side of the coin of the quantum conversation, but they haven't been really explicit on the contributor-based conversation either. As you mentioned, only 2 countries, and I'll come back to that, have been giving some matrix and indicators, but otherwise, what we've been hearing in the room is that some countries, such as the US, have a list of countries, not saying who, not saying what, not saying how, but just, saying that it's very, very important for them. They have a list of 6 countries. That's what they said in the room. But then they don't say anything more, and they keep their card to the chest. They don't say anything about the quantum, so not even about a range of what we could be talking about. And then they expect the negotiation to go to flow and achieve an ambitious and equitable outcome in Baku. So I mean, we are in a situation of real bad faith, if I can call it like that. And so the contributor base is maybe a legitimate question to ask on a more distant manner to see, okay, if we could consider at some point having a revision of the way things are happening, but then also talking about the new burden sharing agreements, looking at things on a more holistic manner. But the way this debate is now used is really to hijack the NCQG conversation, to kind of have the NCQG hostage, because as Alejandra was saying before, all they want is actually to target China. And so they don't really care about an ambitious outcome. They just want to have this contributor base solved in the context of the NCQG, which I must say is totally unfair and unacceptable. So that's, I think, the first state of play I think we should be aware of. And looking at where things are now and looking at the really worrying states negotiation are at, coming with this contributor-based conversation as a condition for an ambitious quantum, again, has to be denounced and has to be pushed back. So if we'll now, I can answer your question again, I'll be a good student. And if you look at the different proposition on the table, so you have on one side of the spectrum, the US, saying that the goal is voluntary and everybody should contribute and there is no obligation. That's one aspect of the conversation. Then indeed we had Switzerland and Canada proposing, I think it was maybe over summer. So it came quite late. If you remember that we had 3 years of technical process discussing about all this, it came a few months before COP, proposing indicators and matrix based on the 10, I think, biggest emitters of GHG emission, and looking at the gross national income. And I think that's where the propositions are a little bit different. So depending on one the other, it's not exactly the same countries that are targeted. And other developed countries, I was saying, have been very vague. Most of them are saying that it's very important for them, that it should be a condition. Again, Jennifer Morgan said this morning that, an ambitious quantum is linked to an ambitious list of new contributors, but they haven't been saying anything. And on the other side of the room, rightly so, developing countries have been saying that it's not the place to discuss this, right? Developed countries have historical responsibility. They haven't been meeting those historical responsibilities. They haven't been fulfilling the 100 billion goal. So the time is not now to discuss about who should be the new contributors, right? This is not the space, and the NCQG should be about developed countries' obligation to developing countries and focusing on public finance provision in the first place. So I think the G77 is really aligned. at least in their official communication about that. And I think as civil society, we have to be clear as well on this kind of tactics and, delaying tactics and strategy that developed countries have been using around that debate, and that kind of conditionality they're bringing to push for an ambitious quantum, so to say, and again, diluting the responsibility in the first place. So while, again, some could argue that it's a valid question if they want to, it's not the time and it's not the place. So that's, I think, a really important point for the negotiation moving forward.
Thanks for that very comprehensive overview of where those conversations lie. Alejandra, I'm wondering if you can very quickly share some thoughts around the various positions taken by different negotiation blocks and countries, and where kind of the main tension points are. I know Rebecca had already spoken to it quite a bit, but based on your work tracking some of the ALAC, the Latin American countries' positions on this, curious if you could share some thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Rebecca has already summarized what's out there. So I'll just add a couple of issues. This is a very characteristic negotiation of the UNFCCC, developed countries in one side, developing countries in the other side. So there are two blocks. So it's not like 100, it's just two blocks in terms of the contributor base. Developed countries wanting more countries to be part of this, in particular China, and developing countries, basically just standing in the mandates of the negotiation of the goal and the responsibilities in the international treaties they are part of. So developed countries have very clear responsibilities to provide financial resources in the UNFCCC. And this was taken forward in Article 9.1 and 9.3 of the Paris Agreement. And it's like, in legal terms, there's nothing more obligatory than a shall. And Article 9.1 says, developed countries shall provide financial resources to developing countries. Like, if I'm not an English speaker, if that is not clear enough, what is? Now, Article 9.3 is talking about the leadership of developed countries in mobilizing financial resources. I think if I explain this to my kids, if you want to be a leader, you have to lead so that somebody else follows. Developed countries have not been leading on this, and they have not shown any specific number of how they will lead the quantum of the NCQG so that others follow. And so I have an existential question in now that we are heading to the end line of the negotiation of the NCQG. What if China actually agrees to provide financing? Because I think it is important to also look at the reality of where we are living. China, Brazil, Mexico, and many other developing countries provide cooperation on climate finance, a South-South cooperation to many developing countries. That's a reality. It's happening. So what if China agrees to say, okay, I'm going to contribute 50 billion? Are developed countries ready to put forward a really ambitious proposal of leadership in the provision and the mobilization of financial resources? That is not in the table. So I think, and I truly agree with what Rebecca was saying. So broadening the base of donors should not be a condition for the agreement of the NCQG, because it's not the responsibility of any developing country, it's the responsibility of developed countries. But if they want to base this on Article 9.3, and because all of their argument about the broadening the contributor base is that 9.3 is calling for others to also participate, I think it is important that they show that they are leading. They aren't. And I've heard informally that some developed countries are talking about maybe a 300 billion goal, which I think it would be substantially inadequate to what we are trying to agree, and inadequate to what they are called to do in this leadership role. So yeah, I think these are a couple of other ideas that are important to bear in mind in terms of this conversation.
Thank you, Alejandra. Carola, are there any last pieces that you'd like to add before we pass it off to the audience to ask their questions? Or maybe thoughts around landing this debate? I know everyone's trying to find ways of where the landing zones.
No, I think it's important to acknowledge what they were saying. This process is not the place, not the time to talk and discuss about this contributor-based increase. And we also need to understand that private sector, MTBs, philanthropy are not like stakeholders that have a mandate or an obligation under the UNFCCC. So why are we trying to put goals or aspirational goals to them? That is not about that. It is about the commitment of the climate debtors to the developing countries that are suffering the impacts. And I think we need to be very strong within this logic of climate justice. We need to be strong in the narratives. We need to support our countries in the global south and demand them to take to the negotiation table like a regional and global south perspective, but a common discourse as well, because that is another tactic of the global north. They are always repeating the same lines, like they are reading and studying them all the time. But global south countries have like different positions, similar ideas, but maybe they are not so aligned. And I think that is where they're becoming weaker. And I think that is something that the civil society should support. And we have a lot of research, we have a lot of narratives, campaigns that can help us, can help them. We can guide them in this process. And I think that is something that we need to do. And I think we're doing it. So let's keep doing it and don't lose the hope and expectations for this process.
Yeah, thanks for that really hopeful note. And I think, and really huge appreciation for you for connecting it back to climate justice and equity. I think that was a really great way to wrap up all the themes that have been running throughout the session today. So lots of appreciation to all our panelists. I'll pass it over to the audience. Is there anyone in the call today who would like to who has a question that they'd like to ask? And feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat. Vicky, would you like to go ahead?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for this really amazing presentation and discussion. I'm Vicky. I'm lucky to work with Soomin at CAN-Rac Canada. And one thing that's been kind of on my mind is how we convince kind of public audiences of the need for a really strong, ambitious NCQG at a time when even in rich countries, there's kind of a scarcity mindset and people are so focused on their immediate concerns around cost of living and so on. So I'm curious if there are any, like you've all spoken really well about the inadequacies of the 100 billion goal and all the kind of failures of that, but are there any success stories that you have been able to, that you've seen that can help kind of convince people of the power of climate finance and kind of what's possible when we do it right?
Thanks for your question. Anyone would like to take a first go at responding? Go ahead, Alejandra.
Thank you for the question. I think yeah, one thing that we have been trying to discuss with many other CSOs and think tanks is how successful developed countries have been in creating this idea of public finance scarcity. We are not in the Middle Ages. We are not in a world of a public finance scarcity or global finance scarcity. We live in a world of 100 trillion global economic output each year. 100 trillion. We are trying to get a goal that is at least 1 trillion. So what we are trying to do here and what we are trying to say and developing country negotiators are trying to say is, isn't it worth to mobilize 1% of the global economic output to save the future of mankind? And developed countries own around 60% of this global economic output. So let's not talk about public finance scarcity because we are not living in a world of scarcity. It is misallocated. There's a lot of money going to fossil fuel finance. There's a lot of money going to wars. And there's a lot of money going to places, consumption, for example, that are not directed to climate justice and climate action. But I think it is very important that we put ourselves in a mindset of global capital liquidity. This is where we are at.
Thanks very much for putting that into context. Really appreciate your articulating that argument.
Yeah, thanks again, Alejandra, for your thoughtful answer there. Rebecca, I see that you've...
No, I was actually going on this exact same line, and Alejandra articulated way much better than I could do, but maybe just to add also on the feasibility part, and the fact that we are often told as unrealistic, or our civil society is asking for too much, or developing countries' government are unrealistic and idealistic, or I don't know what kind of patriotic word, patronizing wording we can hear in the negotiating rooms. But you were referring to earlier to the OCI report, and I mean there are many work and study that has been done on the levers developed countries have in their hand to pursue tax justice measure, to redirect public finance out of harmful activities and actually unlock trillions. The political feasibility depends maybe on the context. I'm not saying it's easy everywhere, but all those measures together can raise like trillions of money. So just looking at some of them could actually really counter easily the argument of public scarcity and liquidity squeeze and whatever else we hear. So it's actually about being realistic and pragmatic and use the tools they have in their hands within their political power domestically, but also within the global international financial architecture to really make those changes. So we can't really actually accept those kind of discourses and narrative anymore. So yeah, just building on that.
A huge thanks to all our...
No, and if I just can complement, we need to think about out-of-the-box solutions to provide this fast climate finance to the world in the short time that we have. And debt cancellation could be one, tax justice can be one. We're talking about taxes to the wealth, green taxes to the big fossil fuel corporations that could provide the money that we need, but also there are other mechanisms that are not being discussed in the NCQG process. For example, the special drawing rights, which is like an emission of new money that can be allocated in the time of crisis, which has been used after the pandemic. $650 billion have been created and distributed. And why aren't we considering this kind of other mechanisms to solve this crisis, to really respond to the needs in a fast way, considering it is an emergency? It is all about political will and about the reforming the international financial architecture, because these decisions are being taken by the climate debtors, unfortunately, and they don't want to change the things. They want the business as usual because they don't want to affect their interests or the interests of their corporation. So that is my final message.
Thank you, everyone. Sorry, I think my Zoom kicked me out for the past 10 seconds, so my apologies for that. But I know we're at time here. A huge round of thanks to our panelists today for sharing all your insights and your reflections. I really appreciate the research that you folks have been leading and the advocacy work that you've been leading internationally and within your countries as well and within your regions. So thank you so much for making the time to join us during such a busy time. I'm looking forward to staying in touch with how the negotiations will unwrap, I suppose, in the next few coming weeks. If you folks want to share your social media and the handles in the chat here, I'll be sure to share them around with folks as well so they can stay up to date with your work in the future. And for everyone else who is on this call, thank you for joining us again as well. And our fourth and last webinar will take place at the end of October on Canada's commitments and progress in climate finance as it prepares for COP29. And we look forward to seeing you then. So thanks again, everyone. Huge thank you to our panelists again for joining us, and take care. See you next time.